So for our first session today, let's welcome Misty Wilson. She is an ESL Program Development and Research Manager at IELTS. So let's welcome Misty for her presentation. Whenever you want, Misty.
All right, thank you. So happy Saturday, everyone. If you don't mind, let me know where you're listening in from so I know who all's in the audience. And I'll go ahead and start. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So my name is Misty Wilson, and I work with IELTS USA. And the study that I'm sharing with you today, I conducted as a part of a doctorate of education program with Northeastern University. So I am coming to this topic of language assessment literacy from a different viewpoint. So many presentations here from language assessment experts, and I'm coming from more of the university test user experience. And thank you to everyone who has said hello. Welcome, Tony, Claudia. So I became interested in this topic when I was serving as the director of an ESL program. And while I was director of the ESL program at a university, these decisions were being made to accept different tests, to change test scores, and sometimes I'd be included on these decisions, and sometimes I wouldn't. So I was very interested in how these decisions were being made, how admission professionals were choosing which tests to accept, what that decision-making process was like, especially because preparing learners for academic study, I knew that there's a lot of other factors beyond language proficiency that determine whether a student, might be successful in an academic program. But research and research studies that have tried to link language proficiency with academic outcomes have had really mixed results. But there seems to be a consensus that there's a threshold of language proficiency that's needed to make sure that a student will be able to have positive academic outcomes. So that, in line with the research that's been conducted on university test users that suggests they may not have the language assessment literacy needed to make decisions, prompted me to investigate how admission professionals made sense of their decision to accept a short online English test as proof of English for undergraduate and international student applicants. So I began my study pre-COVID, but all of my data collection happened after COVID. So that definitely played a part in some of the decision-making. So I had two research questions. How do admission professionals make sense of their decision to accept the test? And also, how do they make sense of their role in choosing a cutoff score for the test? So for my theoretical framework, I chose heuristics, which is a strategy that ignores part of the information with the goal of making decisions more quickly, frugally, or accurately than more complex methods. And to understand heuristics, we could take a step back and think about what is rational decision-making. And you might think of the game of tic-tac-toe. And as most players know, there is a strategy you can employ that will ensure that you win every time, no matter how your opponent plays. So according to Wilkinson and Kleiss, that's an illustration of rational decision-making. But humans don't always operate using best response strategy, especially if there's any uncertainty that comes into play. And so one way of understanding why we operate outside of best response strategies is through heuristics. Initially, it is viewed as a kind of an error-prone decision-making process, but recent literature has shined light that people use heuristics because they often work, not just because they reduce cognitive strain. So these are some commonly reported heuristics, and I chose not to use priori codes and go in with through the lens of heuristics as I was looking through my data. Instead, I applied heuristics only after I had already conducted some analysis and looked at the themes through this lens. So for my methodology, I began with my own philosophical assumptions, which align with the constructivist paradigm. So reality is subjective, it's influenced by individuals, and the interaction between the individual participant and the researcher. And so this led me to interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is a qualitative research method that aims to create a detailed account of a specific experience from participants while recognizing that the researcher brings her own interpretation to those conceptions. So double hermeneutics is involved. In order to understand a participant's perspective, one that they might not even be aware of, the design of the study needs to be flexible. So I use semi-structured interviews, and I use snowball sampling to find participants. So that's a recruitment technique where you find a participant, and then they assist you in identifying the other participants. Ultimately, I recruited 7 admission professionals. And as you can see from this chart, they came from a variety of different types of university settings and had very different international enrollment numbers, as you can see on the right side. And I initially thought, well, I have an institution that's 200 students and an institution that has, 17,000. Surely there's going to be a lot of variation in how these decisions are made, but actually there was a lot of similarity. For my data analysis, I used an analytic process for coding and began coding by hand and then moved to using qualitative software. Ultimately, I was able to create this chart of recurring themes. So you have the superordinate themes in darker color and then the sub-themes below. And as you can see, there was a lot of connection between the participants' experiences. Now I want to walk you through each of those sub-themes and some of the data that supports that, some of the quotations that support these themes, and then I'll take you through my findings. So I found that in terms of the power of the decision-making, only 2 participants used the word autonomy when describing their role in the decision to accept an English test. But it was clear that there's a great deal of autonomy. So Dell says, my office was able to decide whatever we want and then go tell other people that this is what we're doing. Ali said, I think there's a lot of faith that's placed into the work my team does and the research that they do in choosing tests. Only 4 of the 7 participants mentioned any discussions with other stakeholders on campus as part of their decision-making process. But those who did have discussions, many used the term keeping in the loop endeavors, right? So Dell said, there's some stakeholder buy-in that needs to happen, obviously, but it wasn't like the decision was outside of our office. We didn't have to ask someone else to be able to accept Duolingo English test. Blake said, we're very careful with the delegated authority. We're not about to bring on a test without talking to the vice provost for undergraduate education, saying, hey, this is what we want to do. But that's, I think, just campus collegiality or politicking, depending on your take. Many of the participants really trusted the test creator's word that it was a good test. So Ali says, the research that Duolingo's done and the evidence that they have presented to me and to us makes us fairly comfortable and secure. Ev said, which I'm in no way a computer scientist, data scientist, so it took me a lot to understand this. They're referring to the report that was provided by Duolingo. But it's all pretty amazing stuff. The people work there seem pretty much to know what they're talking about. And this was a common thread. Several of the participants said that they didn't really understand the research that Duolingo was providing them, but they felt like it was an important part of their decision-making process. And then Duolingo being able to show a strong correlation between Duolingo English test scores and TOEFL and IELTS scores gave us some confidence in the test. And that, of course, is the concordance that's published in their technical manual. Tracking students, there was a lot of faith in that they would be able to identify whether this was a good decision or bad decision based on how students were doing. Ali, here in this top quote, mentions that recognize that this was a different kind of year with COVID, and so it's not going to be really easy to track these students as they would in a typical year. And then Gail, in terms of tracking students, had a kind of a broader understanding of that, was looking at it through complaints, right? So Gail says, we haven't heard complaints from students. We haven't heard overall complaints from faculty that said, why did we let this kid in who really was not qualified or anything like that? So overall, we've been really satisfied with the test. There's also some institutional safeguards that helped make them feel comfortable in the test. So Dell said, essentially, we're able to take risk with Duolingo English test because we have our own internal placement test and that internal assessment that every student takes. So no matter if they come in with a TOEFL or IELTS, this institution had them take a placement test upon arrival. Kai said, and so we always have a sort of second layer of exam or protection or whatnot. The students hate it, but it's important. So I feel like we're somewhat protected in terms of adding a new exam and not knowing, but knowing that we have another layer that can help us. And what's interesting is that 6 of the participants had placement tests. 1 participant didn't. And they also said that one of the reasons why they chose the test was because a peer institution was accepting it. And they named one of the other institutions that was in my study. So some institutions were accepting it without understanding the kinds of safeguards that other institutions had. Removing barriers was also a very common theme across every participant. So Kai said, we're trying to break down barriers. Duolingo is a clear option to help remove barriers, as well as broaden our reach and our access to a wider group of students. Ali said, and so I think even without knowing for sure what the outcomes are going to look like, in the current world, the accessibility was just the most important thing for us. What others are doing, I've said, yeah, we're looking, so we looked at other institutions are accepting. Dell said, it's just, explain this as a collective kind of trust that if other institutions are vetting it, and we're all kind of deciding together that we're going to take this step, then you feel more confident in accepting it. Okay, so now I'd like to jump into my findings. And for my first finding, only one participant had anything in writing that delegated the authority to admissions and provided some guidance, albeit misguided guidance, which I can talk about in the question and answer section. But it was clear that the admission professionals in the study really had a great deal of autonomy and power. And even when they used the term recommend, it was clear that they had more power and that the additional layers of approval were merely signing off on the decision. And then some actually expressed whether this level of autonomy was good, and they said that they were surprised by the level of autonomy that they had. And there was that a level of autonomy is needed within enrollment management is supported in the literature. So there's been some focus on the type of entrepreneurial orientation that admission professionals need to have. There was a mixture of involvement from faculty in these decisions. In the cases where the enrollment managers reached out to ESL professionals on campus, the decision in each of those cases was made to not accept the test until COVID-19 hit. So it showed a willingness to listen to ESL professionals or other experts, but not all admission professionals expressed this willingness to engage in conversations. And Gail actually said that they heard from other colleagues that there was more of a pushback from ESL teachers, and it's understandable, right? In the best interest, they would like to keep their program robust, and they would prefer that students come and learn the language from them. So I found this really surprising that they felt this, and I'm curious if this is felt more broadly among admission professionals or not. When it came to faculty senate involvement, only one admission professional had something in writing that did dictate the decision to go before the faculty senate, but the participant called them a rubber stamp by the time the decision got to them, and was able actually to avoid going before the faculty senate by accepting the test on a temporary basis. And there was nothing that guided how long a test could be accepted on a temporary basis. So kind of a loophole that allowed this admission professional to choose any test they wanted. As long as they said it was temporary, then again, doesn't have to go through the faculty senate. The second finding on here is that admission professionals' professional roles impacted their decision to accept the test and their information gathering activities. So in this study, all the participants used terms like remove barriers and access, and there was a clear concern for student access. But participants discussed this desire for greater student access, and it was intertwined with the concerns of falling enrollment and the need to meet enrollment goals. So though enrollment goals were a major contributor to the decision to accept Duolingo before COVID-19 hit, for those who had waited, they expressed that access after COVID-19 was even of more of importance, even though they had concerns about the test. And another kind of external pressure was the fear of being left behind. And one participant said, when something becomes an expectation from students, you have to really give it serious consideration because it can hurt you in terms of your admission funnel. There was also a second element of this, how their professional role impacted their decision. The activities that they engaged in. It appeared in all of the experiences of the participants that the decision to accept the test was kind of made by gut instinct, and that in their information gathering process, it wasn't about trying to figure out, is this a good test or not? It was about collecting data to convince other stakeholders or to have on hand in case any questions arose about it. And in all of the cases, none of the admission professionals reached out to language assessment experts. They did reach out to ESL professionals in a few cases, but no one mentioned any conversations or reading of anything that was by a language assessment expert. And one admission professional expressed some conflicting feelings about how the decision was made and wondered whether those kinds of decisions should have more vetting versus using what he called gut reaction. So suggests there's an awareness that these decisions might need more careful consideration, but participants seem content with having been given this responsibility with having little guidance, because it allowed for the decision to happen more quickly. My third finding was admission professionals are unaware of potential negative consequences of their decision. So they were justifying their decision to accept the test because they had confidence in their ability to track students and in their in-house placement tests. But it seemed that there might have been a lack of awareness of how difficult it is to really track, students and link, that language test to academic outcomes. For many of them, having a handful of students who used the test as a supplemental test and that they were doing fine communicated that was a good decision. But when a test is used as a supplemental piece of evidence, it's just that. It's usually in tandem with other pieces of evidence. So what happens when it's no longer supplemental, but it's the main piece of evidence? And another area of misunderstanding was the reliance on in-house placement tests. And so the majority had some in-house placement tests that they administered to all incoming international students. So that meant that ultimately the placement was based on their internal placement test, not necessarily on the language test scores that they were providing. So if a student was failing a class, that might be an indication that their placement test is faulty, right? Not necessarily that the language test score that they used had a problem. So I think it would complicate the ability to track students. Also, in some of the cases, they only had one ESL course available. And so I didn't hear any awareness that what if a student needed more than one term? And for the programs that did have several terms of ESL, what if a student got on campus and needed to take 4 terms of ESL before they were able to matriculate? That would add the cost of tuition, the time spent in country. So when they use that word access, I also noticed that they didn't understand some of the repercussions of their support systems that they had in place. And my final finding was that they seemed to be overconfident in their ability to set an appropriate cutoff score. So they heavily relied on the concordance that was published by Duolingo, not just to set the score, but also, as I mentioned earlier, to really validate their decision. It proved to them by seeing Duolingo scores linked to TOEFL and IELTS. For them, that meant that they were equal tests. The most influential piece of research that was cited by participants was the concordance. And that was originally published in Yee's 2014 research report that was commissioned by Duolingo, and it's also in their technical manual. So they felt that, I saw that they lacked an understanding of the nature of concordances and what it means to link scores and what that can communicate if you have 2 tests that have very different test constructs. So even more surprising, I think, was the misunderstanding at the institutional level. And in that one memo that existed that I mentioned earlier that guided how these decisions should be made, what it said, what the instructions were that they could accept any test as long as there had been something published in a peer-reviewed journal that equated a TOEFL score 79 to another test score. So that showed that at the institutional level, there was also a misunderstanding of the nature of concordances and what they can and cannot tell you about a test. The over-reliance on concordance, let's see, and then the list of accepting of what other institutions were accepting was also influential in the scores that they were setting. So they looked at the other institutions, what decisions they were making about the score, and then choosing it based on that. And again, this seemed to have like an overconfidence in that and not understand that other institutions might have support systems that they don't have. Even if they're peer or aspirant institutions, it doesn't mean that they're equal. So implications for practice. I can talk more about this in the question and answer session, but I think that colleges and universities need to create policies that guide this kind of decision making. They also need to provide the decision makers with tools like language assessment literacy or language assessment learning to build that competency so that they're able to make these decisions. But they may also look at whether this is rightfully placed with admission professionals. If admission professionals are guided by their professional role and their enrollment targets, how could that impact this decision? How is there maybe some conflict of that role? Assessment researchers, play a really big part in this. I think that, from the other survey that I've conducted with Beverly Baker, we saw that, university test users do want to have evaluations of tests. They do want to have more information from assessment researchers. So kind of need to connect the two. How do we connect the assessment researchers to the university test users more? And then finally, test creators. There's definitely onus on test creators to be transparent and to not, especially when it comes to concordances, to be clear on what they can and cannot communicate, to help institutions as they're choosing scores, to make sure that they're choosing scores that are appropriate for their students. So, and with that, I will end and take any questions that maybe have come through.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Misty, for that interesting presentation. So let's now see if we have any questions from the audience. All right. Let's see.
Yeah, so I see Pablo's, if you don't mind, I see
Yes,
Pablo's
we have a comment.
that decisions are focused on immediate need, internal politics, and talking the lingo of assessment in ways stakeholders do not understand means that anyone who talks difficult sounds technical. Yeah, definitely, Pablo. I mean, that was, and I heard that from several of them, that I don't even understand what this test creator is giving me, but it's important to have on hand. It's important for other decision makers. So I think it's definitely something that test developers have a responsibility to communicate about their tests in ways that test users understand.
All right. Well, okay, well, here we have another question or another comment from Evelyn King. I think that IELTS should do some soft marketing to inform or educate the decision makers about the nature and benefits of the test.
Yeah, so we do have in IELTS USA, our market is the United States, but we have a number of webinars that we conduct about, questions to ask when evaluating a test, and we do workshop series as well. So we've had a lot of targeted webinars and presentations that are trying to build up this, this competency. But it's, again, as a test creator, we also need the assessment researchers who are not biased, right, to be able to bring this conversation to the test users as well.
That is absolutely related to Nick Saville's question, who says, so how can we communicate this lingo more effectively to get the message across? Any suggestions, maybe in addition to what you have already said?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even just taking like the VRIP, right? Validity, reliability, impact, practicality. Those are basic concepts. And I think we just need to, it's about breaking them down using metaphors. I think it was, can't remember if it was Sarah Cushing recently was presenting about the use of metaphors in language assessment literacy. But we need to in communication with test users, we'll know if we're getting across our message, right? So we need to be in communication more with them and what their understanding of what we're presenting.
Mm-hmm. All right, here we have two questions from Pablo Toledo. The first one is how much of this is influenced by the U.S. admission culture of one person's got I know it when I say it in the U.S. in your view? And he also asks if your research is published or it will be.
Yeah, so currently it's not published. I'm working on adapting it for a journal article, so hopefully sometime in the near future. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I want to explore this professional role and how it impacts decision-making a little bit more. And it would definitely be interested to see, to have a comparison study of these kind of US-based decisions and decisions in other places. But I think that is interesting, and whether that's American culture, or I would just say maybe more of like that business culture of making decisions. But it's an entrepreneurial maybe also, if we look at through that lens of using that gut reaction. But yeah, I would definitely be interested to compare into other contexts.
All right, thank you so much. Well, here we have some comments from people thanking you for your presentation, about the interesting findings you're sharing with us. So, well, thank you so much, Misty, for being with us today. Well, we hope we see you in a future opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone.